All right, so I've just read Nonviolent Communication by I don't know, I already forget the guy's name. I'm not sure this even qualifies as a book. I bought it as an audiobook and it basically was like a series of audio lectures, I guess. Um, and it's very clear that the book that I listened to started out as like a self-help course, basically. I do think that this concept of nonviolent communication has a lot of cultural cachet, even if people haven't necessarily heard those terms. There were a lot of moments during this book where I stopped and I was like, "Oh, that's where that comes from." And I think that the most like I think that the most recognizable effect of nonviolent communication, like the idea and its effect in the culture, is ironically a certain type of toxic and highly violent communication, which I would describe as maybe like nonviolent core communication. People who come in and they're like, listen, they really like set the focus on their feel thoughts and their feelings, and they say, listen, it just really prevents me from fulfilling my needs for self-actualization when you ask me to do the dishes. That kind of communication. I think that is the most recognizable cultural effect of nonviolent communication. Although I suppose that style of communication probably predates this book by quite a bit. But I think that the focus, especially the vocabulary on needs, right? The focus on the way in which a situation is obscuring or preventing or doing something bad to your like human needs. I think that very much comes from this book, and I think it's quite ironic that a style of it's ironic, but at the same time like completely predictable that someone comes out with like, here's the non-toxic way to communicate with people. Toxic people love it when there's a non-toxic way to communicate with people. They can go and grab it and they can use it to do toxicity to each other. I do want to say I feel like I might be giving the impression that I think that nonviolent communication as a concept is like inherently flawed or that there's something that doesn't quite work about it. I do think that there are some problems within the concept, within the idea, but I also think that the people who use nonviolent communication to toxic ends are doing it incorrectly. Like there's a set of procedures that are described in this book, and there's also an attitude and a sort of philosophy of emotions that comes along with it. Those people obviously discard the attitude and the philosophy of emotions, but they also, to some extent, don't follow the procedure correctly. So I think I should start out by just sort of describing the procedure, right? The book basically claims that a lot of our communication around our emotions is essentially miscommunication because people jump to conflict when it's not necessary, and that what we need to do instead is we need to clearly articulate what it is that we need and the ways in which the situation is not fulfilling those needs, and that needs to be a sort of neutral expression of our uh, not desires but needs, our emotional state, and how that connects to our needs. Um, this is the starting place for nonviolent communication, right? And the idea is that most people, the vast majority of people, bear like a the default attitude towards other people is one of like mild positivity, if I encounter a person on the street, I don't have particularly strong feelings one way or the other, but I do have a mild feeling of like, I hope the best for that guy. It would make me feel bad if something bad happened to that guy, and it would make me feel good if something good happened to that guy. If a guy's walking around and they've just got a smile on their face, I think nice. So that's the sort of default starting point of humanity, which is honestly a very good. It's a good. It seems like we're in a good position to be consistently giving each other what we need, right? If I can do something that is minimal effort on my part that has a big effect on someone's mood and a big positive effect, then obviously I'll do it, right? So then the question becomes like, why we don't actually behave that way, right? What is it that what is it that's going wrong? And this book does sort of try to answer that question. It basically believes that people have a sort of like defensiveness. They really, really rush to attack and judge each other in a way where they articulate what it is that they need or what's going wrong in their life or what could be different in a way that does not have any um, they sort of immediately want to externalize their problems onto other people and blame them for their problems. And of course, if someone alerts me to a way that I can slightly change my behavior and make their life better, I'm gonna go, okay, sure, yeah, fine. Um, but if someone instead articulates that same idea as essentially an insult, if they come along and they say, you're ruining my life by doing this, I'm gonna get defensive and I'm not going to want to change my behavior. They're attacking me. And then even if I kind of want to change my behavior, it now has this additional cost of like I'm letting them sort of like win this interaction. So that's why people are shit to each other all the time. That's the theory of this book. It's one that I quite like. So the style of communication that is pioneered here, the nonviolent style of communication, is one in which your goal is essentially to let the other person know about your emotional state and how it connects to your needs as a human being. So you don't jump to judgments. You start by articulating what you're feeling in the moment, by the way. You don't talk about how you felt before. You don't talk about how you're going to feel. You talk about how something makes you feel. And you want to ground yourself in the present tense as much as you possibly can, right? So if you're talking about a past injustice or a past slight, you don't talk about the things that you felt at the time. You talk about the things that you're feeling right now. And so that places the focus on things that we can actually do about the way that you're feeling right now, right? Because if something bad happened to you in the past, the problem isn't the bad thing that happened in the past. The problem, presumably, is the way that that is making you feel right now and what it's doing, how it's like impeding your needs or whatever. Okay, great. So you articulate your feelings. There's a whole chapter explaining how people oftentimes like the verb I feel is much more flexible than the concept of feelings, right? Like I can say I feel like you're a dumb fucking bitch. Right? I can say that. And that's obviously not an expression of my feelings. That's an expression, a rather strong expression of my judgment of your character. But we also say things that are judgments of this type that are that like in common that aren't so obvious as judgments, right? Like for instance, you could say I feel disrespected. I feel disrespected. That's closer to an expression of your emotions, right? But it's still a judgment. You're saying I presume that this person doesn't respect me, right? So there's a lot of kind of like weird gray area here, right? People can say I feel and then whatever. Um, Okay, so the goal is first of all, you start by saying what your emotion is, and then you try to locate that emotion. You try to explain how that emotion is connected to some need that is either not being fulfilled or that you feel is in threat of not being fulfilled, right? And essentially, the way that this guy talks about it is that we have a need, we have this sort of like meta need, right? We have basic needs of like food, shelter, love, blah, blah, blah. And then we have this meta need, which is essentially, he doesn't use that language, that's the language I'm coming up with. The meta need is to feel that our needs will be met in the future, right? If you're not hungry right now, but there's no food in your house and you don't have any money, that doesn't represent like that is a need, right? You have a problem that is imminent to you, even though it has not yet started to like kill you. So we have this need for security. We have basic needs, and we have the need to believe that our basic needs are going to be met in the future, right? Okay, great. So you start with an emotion and then you say how that's affecting your need. And usually, like oftentimes, that's kind of enough, right? Because if people see that something is wrong, that your life could be made better in some way, usually if they can, they'll kind of like do something about it, right? So, especially if you're in an environment where people are already friendly, right? So I feel like this is kind of common sense to my generation, but I feel like older people kind of struggle with this sometimes. Like if you were allergic to something and your group of friends wanted to go to a restaurant where they like mainly serve food that is like prepared with that allergen, it would not, I think, feel uncomfortable or difficult to just be like, "Hey, I'm allergic to this food, right? And that means that when we get to this restaurant, I'm not going to be able to eat anything." And that is like that's enough. You don't even have to make the request like, "Hey, can we go somewhere else?" People will be like, "Oh, yeah, of course," like obviously. So oftentimes, especially in a friendly environment, just expressing the emotions plus the need is enough to make everything come together. But there's also a third step for you know that is sometimes necessary, which is making requests. And this is the part where I think that this system gets interesting and where I start actually having things to say about it, right? Making requests. So making requests is the third step. You articulate your emotions, you say how they connect to your needs, and then you make a request for ways in which you think that need could be met. So, there's a couple of problems here, right? Which is that the one that jumped out to me immediately is that this system is not exactly foolproof, right? Once you get to the point of making requests, there becomes kind of a problem, which is what happens when people have competing needs, right? And the book never really addresses this question directly, but the problem is, even if we're doing this nonviolent communication, what essentially happens is if you have a need that competes with my need, and we're nonviolently communicating with each other, we sort of have to decide like whose need is more important. What are the relative proportions of these two needs? This is a type of conflict that so-called violent communication is designed to avoid. Like, I want thing A, so I say, hey, it'd be really nice if I could have thing A, no worries if not. You say, oh, that doesn't really work with me because blah blah blah, and I go, no, it's fine. And this is a style of communication that I think that the this book would say is like not really ideal, right? However, it does something really important. This is, I think, the main benefit to violent communication, is that you get to completely avoid the extremely uncomfortable question of, okay, is my need more important than your need? How are we going to weigh the relative importance of these two things, right? It allows you to just kind of go around that problem. And I mean, there's a lot of room for like unfairness in going around a problem like that, but there's also a lot of room for unfairness in this like nonviolent communication style, right? Because essentially, the issue is that if someone overstates the extent of their needs, it puts them in a situation to get more of the things that they want out of you. So, like, I think what's interesting is that this nonviolent communication style, it is not a communication style that avoids conflict. As a matter of fact, it is a communication style that kind of leads you into much more direct conflicts than you will typically be having, right? The violent communication style, the main conflict that it causes is basically like a form of miscommunication. People get their egos involved in these negotiations and then they're just yelling at each other and they don't know why. Um, but it also completely avoids the situation of we just straight up have competing needs. We can't both get what we want. And so like whose needs are more important? Whereas this nonviolent communication style is like a bloodhound for that type of situation. It leads you directly to the situation where you're saying, I want A, you want not A. We can't both get what we want. We both consider this to be a need. Do we just, I don't know, hit each other with sticks now? Like, um, so that's one thing I would say about this nonviolent communication style. It definitely, I would say, is better than the violent communication style. Like, those conflicts are going to exist whether they're acknowledged or not, and at least once you acknowledge them, you can kind of I don't know, I guess that's like better in most scenarios. But also like thinking about this critically, it makes it very, very clear to me why people actually don't tend to use this communication style. Why it is that we've invented this more indirect way of posturing and negotiating around each other, because it avoids people having to like directly say, I'm sorry, I just don't care about your needs enough to make this change. Whereas the nonviolent communication style actually demands that that's what you do. Okay, there's also a discussion about requests versus demands, which I found really interesting, and I think this is part of the toxicity that people can sort of smuggle back in to this way of communicating. So there's a big distinction made between a request and a demand. A request is when you ask someone to do something, and a demand is when you ask someone to do something and there is a threat of punishment or reward. And the or reward part is really interesting, right? Because the problem here is not just that you are potentially punishing someone. It's that you're conditioning your own actions on their actions, right? You're having a fucking negotiation. You're having a trade war with this person. Like, if you do X, I'll do Y. Is the structure is the same, regardless of whether or not your counteroffer is a threat or an offer, right? So a demand is something where you basically condition your behavior on the other person's behavior, right? Not the same thing as a request. This is kind of counterintuitive, right? Because the idea is that in nonviolent communication, the only reason you would ever do something for someone is just a fully authentic, unmotivated desire for them to just be happy, right? If you do something for someone, it's because you want them to be happy, which is really nice. I like that. But it seems like a communication style that requires a certain degree of, I'll just say, like, love on the part of the people who are communicating with each other. I'm kind of suspicious as to the ability for this communication style to work for people who don't really care about each other. The author doesn't really get into detail because the whole point of the book, I think, is for people to use this communication style in their personal life, and they're presumably not like entering into like hostage negotiations with each other. But the book does say that this method is useful for those sorts of like high stake negotiations. We're going to come back to this topic because the author specifically mentions his pride at these techniques being used in the Israel Palestine conflict. And I just like, I could feel, I rolled my eyes so hard, I felt like they were going to fall out of my fucking head. So we'll come back to this topic of how this gets used in a political context. But for now, let's keep it personal. So it's interesting because I do think that these techniques are very useful for like people that you feel good about. You know, when we're on the same page that all thing at a minimum, I think when we're on the same page that all things being equal, if I can do something for you that doesn't really cost me anything or doesn't cost me very much, I probably will. And I do think that is the default state of most human beings towards most strangers. And I do think that's the state of most people towards their friends and their family. So that's good. Like it's a useful style for a lot of people. Um, okay, I just realized we rushed past the requests and demands, right? So the thing that's interesting about a request and a demand is that you don't actually know what's a request and what's a demand. There's no thing that you can use to determine the difference between a request or a demand. I suppose the thing is, you can sometimes hear something and say, okay, that's a demand because this person is threatening to shoot me if I don't do what they say. But you can't hear something and say, that's a request. Because I think in personal communication, there is, even if we try really hard to avoid it, right? There is always sort of an implicit threat or reward in us making a request of people. And I think it's very, very hard to make a request that doesn't have that implicit uh, reward or threat baked into it, right? Even if I just neutrally ask someone to do something, I think we will all sort of implicitly assume I'm gonna like you a little bit more if you do this thing for me, versus I'm gonna like you a little bit less if you don't do this thing for me. And that is a demand, right? Like if I'm conditioning my opinion of you, even if it's something abstract, like, oh, I just won't like you as much, that's still a demand, right? The other thing that's really interesting is that we don't actually find out if something is a request or a demand until it is denied, right? So if someone says yes to your request, we never find out was it really a request. We only find out if it was a request or a demand when the request is denied, right? And then if nothing happens, turns out it was a request. And if something does happen, turns out it was a demand. So I think this is where the toxicity comes in, right? Is when people are able to use this language. Because the other thing that this book says, and I think this is absolutely correct, is that if you use this language, you will get what you want from people a lot more often. Like, if you don't get your ego involved, if you're not trying to like defeat people, if you're not trying to cast aspersions or blame on people, if you're just trying to say how you feel and what you need and why, people will meet you where you're at a lot more often. And that's totally true. But it opens up the possibility of these techniques being used as basically a cynical strategy to just get what you want more often. And that's totally like, I don't want to say it's good. I'm hesitant to use the word valid, but it's totally a valid way of reading the book. Like if we're going to view this purely as a self-help exercise, you can essentially take the techniques for getting what you want and leave everything else behind, and you will genuinely get a lot more of what you want. Like if you are vulnerable in this way that is not very natural to people, where instead of like making a judgment or something like that, you just say, I feel X, and that's connected to need Y, and can we do something about this? You will get people to act on your behalf way more often. But but there's a philosophy that is supposed to come with all of this, right? And that philosophy is one in which you should not be cajoling. You should not be in like negotiations with people where you condition your behavior on their behavior. Like that's just not good. You're just not supposed to do that. And the problem is that you can state your demands like their requests because that's a good way to get what you want. And then when that doesn't work, you can fall back on violent communication and you can essentially just you can just like revert, right? You can see that your techniques for getting what you want haven't worked, so you're going to revert to violent communication and you're going to use threats or promises of reward, like, oh, I'll do this for you, or and these can be implicit, by the way, right? Like they can be like your opinion of people or something like that. So yeah, I think it's really interesting that these techniques, the full embodiment of these techniques cannot be seen in a single interaction, and you cannot fully embody these techniques while getting what you want, right? Like if you get what you want, we haven't actually fully discovered whether or not your communication was violent or nonviolent. Like it sure did look nonviolent, but of course you don't have the opportunity to use violence to get what you want if someone just gives you what you want, right? So you can't really. It's kind of weird. It's like Schrodinger's nonviolence. Like you can't actually find out if someone is for real nonviolent in their communication style until they like start taking L's, right? Once you start taking L's, you can discover if this is just a technique for getting what you want more often, or if this is or if you're actually like fully embodying the principles here. And I think to like call back to what I said earlier, I think this is where the toxicity comes in, right? Is that this style of communication is actually extremely, extremely useful, even if you have no interest in letting yourself, get less of what you want. Like you can just use the communication style. You can use this like Tinder sort of like mental health core, nice guy type communication to just increase the proportion of times that people say yes to the things that you're asking them to do. And I don't know, I find something about that kind of harrowing that like this philosophy, which is at a very foundational level rooted in a recognition of other people's agency and inherent value as human beings, you can adopt like 70% of it and it will just not I don't know, I don't know if 70%, you can adopt maybe 50% of it and it will just make you like a more efficient, like ruthless sociopath. um so that, I don't know, I find that pretty disturbing. And I think that that is the key to understanding how it is that a lot of these ideas can be used in a toxic way. Like you can use this as a weapon against people if you really want to. You can use nonviolence as a weapon in your as a strategy of violent communication, which is like, I don't know, human beings are complicated. We have such ingenious ways of torturing and destroying each other. Okay, the time has come for me to talk about the political ramifications of nonviolent communication. I think this guy is like mildly full of shit when he talks about the use of these types of communication on the global stage. I do want to talk about there's a situation he describes that I think is basically a good one for thinking about how nonviolent communication can be useful for political situations. He describes going to some country where there was like a tribal war and mediating the tribal war, and he sat down with 12 chieftains from these two tribes that were killing each other, and he basically forced them to use this type of nonviolent communication, right? Like communicate what it is that you feel about the situation, communicate the way that that connects to your needs, and then let's discuss ways that we can have those needs fulfilled. It's a very it's I think one thing that's really useful here is that it connects to the concrete rather than the abstract, right? Part of the something that's built into the philosophy, by the way, is that you are responsible for your own emotions. So you're not completely in control of your own emotions, but nobody else is responsible for them. You are. So if you feel bad about something, feeling bad about something isn't like somebody else's fault, right? Perhaps your needs not being fulfilled is somebody else's fault, but you can't set as a goal, you can't make a request of someone that's like, I feel bad, make me feel not bad. That is not, that's not valid, right? Somebody can help you, somebody can like try to comfort you, somebody can do things that they think will like improve your mood, of course, but one like really important aspect here is that you're basically not allowed to blame your emotions on other people, whatever those emotions may be, right? And uh, that doesn't. I feel like sometimes people might think like, especially when we're talking about rather intense situations, like someone's child has been murdered, let's say. I feel like this might come across as like dodging responsibility for perpetrators. Like, oh, you're not allowed to say, I'm mad that you killed my child, and that's the main thing that you have to deal with is my anger at you having killed my child. Um, but no, you're not allowed to say things like that in this system of communication. You have to say, I'm angry, I'm furious, and that fury connects to my need for justice, you know? And then the thing that we can all focus on is not your emotions because we have no direct control over your emotions. Like we can't directly do anything about your feelings. Instead, we're focused on justice. How do we attain justice, right? And so this style uh, naturally kind of like orients people away from abstract things and much like and towards the concrete, right? Which I think is really, really useful, even in high stakes negotiations with people who don't like you very much. I think it's a very useful technique. Okay, so uh, nonetheless, it does feel extremely, extremely silly to be telling someone, "Oh, your children were murdered," and you feel really upset about that. Well, the fact that you're upset is not directly something that we're going to talk about. Like, tell us what need this feeling connects to, and we'll address the need. Like that does feel very silly. I'm willing to admit. And also, like part of what I thought about when I was reading this book is the way in which it encourages like kind of a space alien way of talking about things. The guy gives many many examples of him using nonviolent communication in environments where you might think that it would be completely ineffective or like where it would feel unnatural or and unusual to use nonviolent communication. And I think the point that he's trying to make is that nonviolent communication can be a like a useful tool even in situations where you might not consider it as such, even in situations where it might feel weird to use. But honestly, all of the examples uses makes him sound like a complete freak. Like he sounds like an alien. So I think part of what needs to do, part of what needs to be done, part of what I will be doing when I think about this book is trying to incorporate some of the techniques into the way that I actually talk and like learning how to use some of these techniques in a way that sounds like you're talking to a human being and not a like therapy bot or a guy who has like learned an algorithm for communicating with human beings. It's a bit weird. I can give an example of something that I have learned to say that I think sounds natural. It's something that I say a lot. If I'm in a situation where I'm communicating with someone and I think that clarity of expression is really, really important, like for example, if someone is giving me instructions, sometimes what I will say is, okay, here's what I heard you say, and I will just paraphrase what they said, and then I will say, is that right? And they will say yes, or they will like make corrections. And this is like for instance pretty useful when people are giving like instructions, right? Here's what you need to do and you need to do it in exactly this way, and if you violate these instructions there's going to be some kind of problem, right? It's something that encourages clarity of communication. So I feel like I need to develop a lot of techniques around the types of stuff that he has said here. Like the guy who wrote this book, it's clear. I get the impression that he's just okay with sounding like a space alien. I am not okay with just sounding like a space alien. I don't want people's response to me to mainly be like, why is this guy talking in this way? This is so strange. I want people to view me as a normal person, and I feel like that perhaps excludes me from fully utilizing these techniques. Like for example, if someone's upset about something, I don't think I'm ever gonna be like, no, 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 you're not. You have to focus on your needs. Like I don't know, I don't know. There's a lot of techniques here that are very very useful conceptually, but I just can't imagine actually using them and not sounding like a weirdo lunatic freak. Um, and maybe that's part of the problem, right? There are some religious implications that we'll talk about in a bit, but anyway, okay, so back to this tribal setting, right? There's these 12 chiefs who are sitting around talking to each other. Essentially the conflict is, I mean, it's one of these like tribal conflicts, right? Where from the outside and also to some extent from the inside, it seems like people's perception of the conflict is they're killing us and we're killing them. And it's simple as they hate us as proven by the fact that they are killing us, and we are simply defending ourselves by killing them. Thus is the sort of end state of tribal conflict, in my opinion. However, when you sit down and you work through the emotions and connect them to needs, the underlying reasons for the conflict become clear, and they can be discussed explicitly. And so it took this guy a really long time to get these chiefs, to express what it is that they needed, what it was that wasn't being fulfilled, which of their needs wasn't being fulfilled and was like fueling this conflict. The fuel was essentially that there's a religious difference. One tribe feels like they don't have the autonomy to have their sort of separate religion. They feel like they're being oppressed, and the other tribe feels that their security is endangered. Right? I it's a much more understandable conflict, at least, than they're killing us and we're killing them. Right? So I think that that's good. But here's the problem, right? I do think that this style of communication can work for groups that are in conflict in which their needs are not irreconcilable, right? The need for autonomy on in one group and the need for security in another group, these are not like irreconcilable needs, right? But there are conflicts in which one side essentially does have an, an irreconcilable need, or at least like a need as they would express it themselves, right? Because the system does not have a way of you pointing at someone and saying, that's not a need, you're a fucking monster. Like, what are you talking about, right? Like, if you got, it's a hyperbolic example, but if you got like the Nazis and a bunch of Jews to sit down at the height of the Holocaust and discuss their relative, needs and blah 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 blah. There's nothing in the system that would allow you to point to the Nazis and be like, "What are you fucking talking about?" Like the need to like be separate from Jews, like what are you fucking doing? Um yeah, there's no system in place to like call bullshit other than just like you have to resort to violent communication in order to like call bullshit here, right? So the problem is what do you do when one side is engaging in bad faith? And I think that this is what made me roll my eyes so hard when he gave the example of Israel Palestine, because maybe to some extent it is useful in peace and conflict negotiations to focus on needs rather than emotions and resentments and blah blah blah. But Israel also has a track record of like lying and like blowing smoke up people's asses and using these kinds of negotiations not as a way to attain peace, but as essentially a weapon, as a strategy in their ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestine, right? So like the problem with this system that I think makes it not not a silver bullet for political conflicts is that it has no way of dealing with bad faith actors, right? On an interpersonal level, when there's a bad faith actor, we can eventually just sort of recognize that this person is acting in bad faith and just kind of move away from them. Like that's not that hard to do, to just be like, if this person views their needs as just being fundamentally so much more important than mine, then like why am I in a relationship with them, right? But you can't do the same thing to like Israel and Palestine. Like ultimately the Israelis, they have a need to live in an ethno state, and the Palestinians have a need to not watch their children be annihilated, right? And these are not two needs that you can just like sit down and you can negotiate how they fit together, right? And furthermore, like any negotiations that do happen, in which the genocidal side is not like abandoning their goal of committing genocide, any negotiations that happen are like in bad faith, you know? I have a need for you to die. Like, okay, there's nothing, there's no like nonviolent communication doesn't like really have anything to add to the mix when those are like the terms, right? And the thing about it is that it's not just that nonviolent communication is not a useful tool in those circumstances. It's also that nonviolent communication, um, it sort of just obscures the violence, right? It wastes everybody's time. It makes us pretend that we can work towards a solution using just our words when we just can't. So I do have a little bit of a critique of nonviolent communication in a political context because I do think there are like bad faith actors, and that sometimes engagement with those bad faith actors on these terms can be like not that helpful. Uh, at the same time, I mean, like I've never been in. I'm sure these techniques are, as a matter of fact, very useful. In a context where you're like two diplomats and you need to stop yelling at each other and you need to actually talk about the issues. But I don't know. Just a lot to there's a lot to think about there. Just like I don't know. Maybe write a comment. Let me know what you think. There's so much to unpack there, and I don't think I am going to unpack all of it right now. Okay, there's one last observation that I want to make about this style, which is that as he was describing the way of communicating, uh, it's occurred to me that it's a very like religious style of communicating. This is one aspect of the philosophy that I haven't really focused on to this point, but basically, like when we're looking at the making requests, like talking to people, making requests side of things. This philosophy kind of seems like essentially a way to get what you want, right? It's essentially a way to say out loud what you want in the way that is the most palatable to people that it possibly could be. And then you're more likely to get what you want, right? But the underlying philosophy is actually a much more sort of like give and take, like mutual recognition of our humanity type of style. I actually didn't realize until I started reading this book that I had learned in college. I had learned and internalized the principles of the sort of listening side of this philosophy, right? The idea is that when you're listening to someone, you want to get to the heart of what they're feeling and how that connects to their needs, right? And that essentially, when people complain, when people say things, and they don't even have to be very good at they don't have to know any of this stuff for you to do this, right? Like when people complain about a situation, you can dissect and analyze it for what are they feeling and how does that connect to a fundamental need. And then you can paraphrase that back to them. You can say, what I'm hearing is that you feel this way because you feel that your need for blah, blah, blah is threatened. And people will often identify with those descriptions. So just by being like a good listener, you can kind of introduce nonviolent communication to an interpersonal context. And that's something that I had basically learned, right? Okay, hold on. And so, hold on, I gotta plug the stupid computer in. Um, okay, so where the fuck was I? This is the kind of thing you don't want to do early on in a video because people will just click away. But you're 39 minutes into this video, right? You're not gonna click away just because I'm plugging my computer in. Um, so anyway, there's definitely a sort of like listening aspect of this philosophy, and I think part of what separates people who toxically apply this philosophy in order to just like get more of what they want is that they essentially ignore the listening part of the philosophy. They're only here to say what they want in the way that is the most compelling that it possibly can be, that is the most likely to get a positive response, and that's all. That's all that they want out of the situation. And I think what separates someone who embodies these principles and is using them in good faith and like trying to actually be nonviolent is whether or not you apply the listening part, right? And so a lot of the application examples are extremely strange. They are very counterintuitive because they essentially consist of someone listening to what the other person is saying. And sometimes the other person is communicating in a very violent manner, right? Listening to what the other person is saying, trying to understand them to the fullest extent that they possibly can, and then the they make a sort of like intervention with a request, or they ask for something, and the conflict just kind of like melts away, right? The conflict just sort of disappears somehow. And I'm not sure. I don't think I'm a good enough person to do that in real life. But it's a very interesting style of communication, even just theoretically, right? As I was listening to these examples, I was like, is this how like Jesus talks to people? Because there are many, many examples in the Gospels in which Jesus seems to not really do that much talking. He shows up in a community, he just kind of hangs out, he just kind of listens to people, he just hears what they're saying, and then he calls them to repent, and they're like, yes. Like, he doesn't say anything, he doesn't make an argument, he doesn't like beat anyone in a debate. He just sort of shows up, he listens to what people have to say, and then he tells them to stop sinning, and they're like, absolutely. And that's exactly the kind of communication style that nonviolent communication encourages. And it's not even it's weird because I think now that I'm describing these things, you can hear why someone who just wants to manipulate people would be very interested in these ideas, right? But the thing is, it does sort of seem like if you want that sort of like Christ-like aura, if you want to be able to just listen, 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 and then people just instantly change and like agree with something that you're asking, your requests have to genuinely come from this place of desiring like a greater flourishing for all of humanity, right? I think that that's the key. Like you can maybe attempt to do these things dishonestly, but people aren't going to like your bodhisattva routine is not going to work to get you out of doing the dishes, because everyone can see perfectly clearly that either you're going to do the dishes or I'm going to do the dishes, and I've done the dishes the last 10 times. Okay, so your Jesus Christ routine is not working on me for this issue. But for something where it is in fact pretty clear that this course of action would increase human flourishing overall, then somehow this kind of like religious attitude can have these, at least as described by this book, miraculous effects. I'm not sure if I fully believe in this, right? Like, I've got to go out in the world and like try it in action, and actually feel out what the limitations are. I can't fully just like conceptually sitting here thinking about it, think like generate limitations. But as someone who writes fiction, I do find it really interesting and really, really compelling, right? Like I've had this question on my mind for quite a while actually, which is, how does this Jesus guy, like, how would you present this as a character that is realistic, that even makes sense? Like he just goes to people and he doesn't even talk, and then they just are like, okay, I repent. Like how does that even make sense? And this book has made that make sense to me. I thought this the whole time, like that I was maybe generating a new thought about this communication style, and then the very end of the book, this guy talks about actually how he realized beyond a certain point that these are, despite him being Jewish and not, he doesn't ever describe himself as being personally religious. I'm not sure what his religious beliefs are, but despite him not being raised a Christian, he realized that this communication style is very like Christian in its core, which I find very interesting. Um, yeah. Okay, that's where I'm gonna leave it off. I feel like I have a lot of like other thoughts about like, the connection to religion opens up an entire new can of worms. Like I feel like you could write an entire separate book that is just about like this as a Christian form of communication, and the way in which it's like limitations and it's actually kind of blindness to power imbalances. Okay, oh my God, I've thought of a thing. I've got to say it again. Oh no, this is horrible. This book completely blind to power imbalances. That's another thing, right? Is that, and some of the examples are blind to power imbalances too, in a really interesting way, is that this communication style, it's not only blind to power imbalances, but it kind of erases them, right? We go on a level in which I am simply making requests, not demands, but requests. And you are simply responding by talking about your feelings, talking about your needs, blah, blah, blah. But, what if I have a gun? What if I have the capacity to change the tenor of this conversation? What if I have demonstrated that if we decide, no, this is a non-violent communication space, we're just trying to see the greatest flourishing for the greatest number of people. But God forbid, if our communication turns to violence, like if communication broke down and became violent, well then obviously I would win because I have a gun and you don't. So there's a way in which this communication style not only is blind to power imbalances, but can kind of serve to erase them. Because like we said earlier, right, the difference between a request and a demand can only be determined by seeing what happens when someone's request is denied, right? And so if you even potentially if you are attempting to communicate completely in good faith, like let's say that you actually are trying to apply these principles, but you have some sort of power behind you, right? Like you're making these types of negotiations and you're the boss at a workplace and you're negotiating with your employees. Well, you hold the power to take these people's livelihoods away from them, right? Even if you're trying to negotiate nonviolently, it probably isn't going to be fully interpreted that way. Like, it's the situation of, I'm not making a demand, but if I were, you would be totally fucked. And we don't know if it's a demand or not. There's no way to find out except for suffering the consequences, yeah? So, yeah, the system is blind to power imbalances in a way that I think is actually has tantalizing and interesting parallels in Christianity. Christianity can also sometimes be extremely, extremely blind to these power imbalances, or at least like Christian institutions and Christian individuals can tend to be blind to these things. Yeah. So, like I said, I've opened the can of worms. The worms are wiggling about, but I do not have time to discuss that topic. I feel like you could write a whole second book on this as like a Christian communication style and like what does that mean for Christianity and has Christianity failed to live up to this and in what ways are the limitations of nonviolent communication also the limitations of Christianity and blah 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 blah. But I've been yapping for almost 50 minutes now, and it is time for me to stop. Okay, bye bye.